Chapter 5 Like the Wolf on the Fold. After the last winter rains, Sennacherib's army would have journeyed across the Euphrates towards these troublesome subjects at the empire's western extremity. As it marched along the arc of the Fertile Crescent towards Kor, that spring of 701 BC, the army must have made an imposing spectacle. Just how big this force was is uncertain, but in major campaigns, Assyria's army sometimes would have fielded armies approaching 100,000 men, and this campaign would have qualified as major. The army would have stretched for miles. In his powerful poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, Lord Byron imagines the force as it surged westward across the plains. The Syrians came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like the stars of the sea, when the blue waves rolls nightly on deep Galilee. Byron is inventing the uniform's colors, but his energetic verse captures the invader's aura of unstoppable might. To someone watching this army's pass, one of its most striking features would have been its disciplined regimentation. This was no ragtag bunch. Unlike the various kingdoms of Kor, Assyria had an army composed largely of professionals. It was also a standing army on duty year-round, while Judah and its neighboring countries had largely to make do with farmers, shepherds, shopkeepers, conscripted for emergencies, augmented by mercenaries and professionals. Assyria posed a veritable war machine. Assyria possessed a veritable war machine. To justify its costly existence and to keep the troops content with plunder, Assyrian kings had to involve the army in military campaigns every year or two, whether or not there was a true crisis that needed attention. Military historian Trevor N. Dupee observes that the nation's wealth and prosperity was sustained by booty and by what seems to have been the first truly military society in history. A.K. Garrison, an expert on Assyria at the University of Toronto, underscores the point. The chief occupation of the Assyrian king and state was warfare. What did the army look like? Most of Sennacherib's soldiers wore mostly cone-shaped helmets, and in battle, chainmail over their torso and legs. All would have worn their hair long but neatly cut at the shoulders. All would have boasted full beards, 2 or 3 inches long, trimmed in a squarish manner, that the many bas reliefs depict all soldiers, without exception, with such beards suggest that they were as de rigueur as crew cuts among recruits today. Anyone observing Sennacherib's troops would have remarked on another trait: their strikingly different ethnicities. Assyrian kings would have commonly pressed the elite forces of conquered nations into their service. Of the many foreign components, the one we happen to know most about was a unit from Samaria, part of the late kingdom of Israel. Military records unearthed from the remains of Sargon's military buildings in the Assyrian city of Nimrud show that 13 officers headed the sizable Hebrew chariot corps. Such officers, suggests historian Stephanie Daly, would have been among the wealthiest and most prestigious members of the royal court. She adds, the Sumerians who served as a national unit in Sargon's royal army must have been so professional as to be utterly reliable, even though they were serving in the army of their conqueror. Whether this crack unit accompanied Sennacherib on his campaign of 701 is uncertain. Still, it is fair to note that Israel's troops were not known for having a soft spot for their Judahite neighbors. Earlier in these same officers' lifetimes, during the Syro-Ephraimite War, Israel's forces would have poured into Judah and unsuccessfully besieged Jerusalem. The Assyrian army had 3 main formations: infantry, cavalry, and chariot corps. Each of those broke down into specialized categories. Thus, the infantry consisted of spearmen, archers, and slingmen. In addition to those weapons, most of these footmen carried straight swords for hand-to-hand fighting. The spearmen did not hurl their missiles. Rather, they hung onto them and used them for stabbing. The soldiers clutched small, circular shields, generally made of wicker and covered with leather. The wicker would have taken the form of plaited reeds or willow twigs. Its main advantage was that it was light and could easily absorb arrows and blows. The archers' shields were far bigger, extending from the head to the toe. Indeed, sometimes these shields were even curved backward over the archer's helmet, especially useful against enemy archers shooting from an elevated position, such as a city's battlements. So unwieldy was this screen that each Assyrian archer required an attendant to hold it. This helper would have vigilantly adjusted the shield to the line of incoming fire while the marksman concentrated on his aim. The archer's bow was generally composite, made of narrow layers of soft, hard wood, animal sinew, and horn all glued together. The horn, often from water buffalo, went to the side of the bow that was away from the archer. The glue might take more than a year to dry. Adhesives was made of the boiled down skin and tendons of cattle, plus the skin and bones of fish. So strong was the weapon made of all these layers that it would take 2 men to bend and string it. The effort was what was worthwhile. An arrow from a composite bow could kill a person at 300 to 400 yards. At close to twice the distance, it could at the least inflict injury. The third kind of foot soldier, the slingmen, operated in teams of 2 behind the archers. They would share a sack of stones. The sling consisted of a small rectangular piece of leather to which 2 rawhide cords were attached. When the soldiers placed the stone in the leather, it became enclosed and would not drop while the soldier, grasping the cords in one hand, whirled it repeatedly above his head. At the right moment, he would release one of the cords, sending the missile on its potentially lethal way. Saddles with stirrups having not yet been invented, horsemen's feet simply dangled or clutched the horse's sides. The riders thus lacked the steadfast base needed for slashing downward forcefully with swords. The Assyrian cavalry relied instead on 2 other weapons, the spear and the bow. The horsemen specialized in one or the other. Horseborne spearmen would have grouped together as a unit, their job to charge into enemy ranks on the battlefield. Behind them followed footmen with spears. Mounted archers composing the other group often had assistants who, riding alongside, held protective shields for their mutual protection. A duo might ride to an advantageous position and remain there for a while, picking off the enemy. While traveling, chariots frequently used 3 horses, 2 to pull and one roped behind the chariot to be used as a spare in the event of injury to one of the others. Yigael Yadin, head of the Hebrew University Institute of Archaeology in Jerusalem and one of the foremost authorities of ancient combat techniques, deems the charioteer to have represented the principal strength and power of the Assyrian army in open battle. Chariots were swift-moving platforms. They provided firm footing for archers, and they sped from one part of the battlefield zone to another. To allow for maximum mobility, they often hovered at the periphery of the action. Under Sargon and Sennacherib, chariots commonly had 3-man crew. One would shoot, one would drive, and the other would hold a shield for the others. Spears would be kept on board in the event that the chariots should enter the fray itself. As with the cavalry, one of the charioteers' tactics was to smash into the enemy ranks and to wreak havoc. Included in this long procession of military units were innumerable supply wagons. These were filled with more than simply food and spare weapons. Some would be loaded with hundreds, perhaps even thousands of shovels and picks for building earthworks around besieged cities. Others carried huge beams that, when assembled, became deadly catapults and siege towers. Finally, oxen pulled oddly shaped skeletal structures with 6 wheels. Structures that, when covered with especially tailored hides, resembled squat, lumbering animals larger than elephants. When the people of the besieged city would see the great machines approaching, some of them 6 yards long and 2 or 3 yards high, they would feel terror, and with reason. Some historians call these mechanisms battering rams, but that is a misnomer. Their purpose was seldom to bash down a door or wall. From base release, we know that the operation was more agile. Inside each of them, slung like a horizontal pendulum, was a huge metal bar. Its forward edge was a bit like an axe blade. The crew inside would stick the blade between two stones in the city wall, then wiggle the bar from side to side until the stones fell out and the hole was made big enough for the troops to rush in. All the while, of course, defenders atop the wall would be raining down missiles and burning oil. For this reason, the machine would often boast a turret that rose like a giant head. Inside the turret, a spotter would look for a huge rock about to descend on the machine. And a spotter would look for huge rocks about to descend on the machine and move the machine out of harm's way. He might have vessels of water with which to douse any flames. For added protection, the besiegers would roll tall towers near the machine. From them, archers would rake the ramparts with arrows. One bas relief shows several of the machines at work next to each other, attacking like wolves in a pack. Judah's army did not seek to challenge the Syrians on any battlefield. Instead, Judah took elaborate steps to prepare cities for sieges. It is likely that Judah was aware of Sennacherib's intentions well before his army set out. The archaeological evidence of Lachish, Jerusalem, and numerous smaller fortified cities suggests that authorities equipped them with clay storage jars in anticipation of sieges. About 2 feet high, these vessels would have likely been filled with oil, wine, and other food stocks. Most adults have already faced invaders earlier in their lives and were old hands at taking elaborate defensive measures. But the Jerusalemites knew that the coming Assyrian invasion called for the extraordinary ambitious step, says the Bible. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib intended to attack Jerusalem, also, he and his officials decided to cut off a supply of water outside the city in order to keep the Assyrians from having any water when they got near Jerusalem. The officials led a large number of people out and stopped up all the springs, so that no more water flowed out of them. The king strengthened the city's defensive by repairing the wall, building towers on it, and building an outer wall. In addition, he prepared the defenses built on the land that was filled in the east side of the old part of Jerusalem. He also had a large number of spears and shields made. The matter-of-fact tone belies the exceptional nature of the engineering projects. The reference to the water supply is of particular interest. The modest springs in nearby hills could be blocked with rocks and other materials. Eventually, because water flows where it meets least resistance, the backed-up subterranean water would find fissures elsewhere in the limestone terrain, perhaps at some distance. These new sources, however, might spring up either in hard-to-spot locations or in rugged terrain that might be difficult for water-hauling vehicles to reach. Yet this operation in the outlying hills would have represented only a sidelight to the centerpiece of the defenders' water denial strategy. A little later, the same biblical passage goes on to say that the Jerusalemites were able to divert the city's own water supply. It was King Hezekiah who blocked the outlet for Gihon Spring and channeled the water to flow through a tunnel to a point inside the walls of Jerusalem. This was Hezekiah's tunnel. Archaeologists' discovery of a 500-yard-long passage has shown it to be a most impressive feat of hydraulic engineering. The water that had otherwise would have overflowed from the Gihon Spring and cave and streamed down the Kidron Valley now took this sinuous course below the city and arrived at a reservoir just beyond the centuries-old walls of the southern end of the city. To prevent the Assyrian access to the reservoir, the Jerusalemites had to achieve another major engineering project. They built a previously mentioned outer wall in places as stout as 23 feet thick and 16 feet high to enclose the reservoir. or Siloam Pool, as they called it. The vital Gihon spring was also inside the wall, and to make it doubly difficult for attackers to take possession of this site and unblock the water source, Hezekiah built the spring a bulky tower 30 feet high. This wall gave much of the city a second ring of defense, also sheltered neighbors that had formerly sprawled outside the original wall. It is likely refugees from Israel after 720 accounted for much of this extramural population. As well, the Jerusalemites reinforced the old inner wall. To do so, they tore down the houses to use their limestone bricks. In addition to this, the anti-Syrian coalition urgently deliberated, playing its ultimate card, sending envoys to Egypt to seek military assistance. Isaiah was opposed to this, and strenuously so. Early in his career, the prophet had been contemptuous of Egypt as a potential ally for practically, as well as theological reasons. Little wonder, over the course of the 9th and most of the 8th century BC, Egypt had declined into a collection of petty warring states, none of them sufficiently powerful to be able to confront Assyria. Egypt's military deficiencies was one of Isaiah's key arguments when appealing to Judah to stay out of Ashdod's rebellion against Assyria in 713. Scorning his king's diplomatic feelers to determine possible Egyptian assistance for such a revolt, he described Egypt as a land in which rival cities will fight each other and rival kings will struggle for power. He concluded no one in Egypt, rich or poor, important or unknown, can offer help. This analysis was, as we will see, accurate in 713, and Egypt's military impotence may help explain why Hezekiah refrained from joining Ashdod's revolt. But now, in the period immediately prior to Sennacherib's invasion, Egypt's internal politics were very different. In 712, a new ruler had moved to take effective control of all Egypt, save perhaps part of the Delta. His name was Shebako. He was a Kushite. Under him and his successors, Egypt attained a level of military strength that it had not seen in centuries. Despite revitalization, Isaiah remained opposed to Judah looking to Egypt for help, even during the frantic period when Sennacherib's assault was imminent. Now, however, with this new dynasty in power, he dropped his former argument that Egypt was militarily incompetent. Instead, he acknowledged that Egypt might offer help, but argued that this would still not suffice for military success. Isaiah's reasoning had become largely theological, referring to those leaders of the military and patriotic party to which Hezekiah was now firmly allied. He preached, "Those who go to Egypt for help are doomed. They are relying on Egypt's vast military strength, horses, chariots, and soldiers, but they do not rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, or ask him for help. He knows what he is doing. He sends disaster. He carries out his threats to punish evil men and those who protect them. The Egyptians are not gods. They are only human. Their horses are not supernatural. When the Lord acts, the strong nation will crumble, and the weak nation will fall. Both of them will be destroyed." As we have already seen, for Isaiah, the Assyrians were like a club that the Lord would use to punish the godless nation with which he was angry. No one, Hebrews or Cushites or anyone else, could thwart Yahweh's will. If Judah were now to drag Cushite Egypt into war, the prophet argued it would effectively be bringing its ally to slaughter. The only way for Judah to avert its divinely ordained ruination, Isaiah insisted, was to make Yahweh change his will, and that, of course, could be done only through Judah's adoption of a more religious reform, social justice, and righteous behavior. Both Sennacherib were about to invade. Hezekiah must have dismissed Isaiah's theological approach as a hopelessly lacking in realpolitik. Desperately, the coalition dispatched envoys to appeal for help from Egypt's new masters. The Kushites were the rebel alliance's last hope. Chapter 6. The Kushites' Self-Interest. Who were the Kushites, and why did they accept the coalition's appeal to send forces abroad for the high-risk mission of confronting a formidable foe? The Egyptians called the land directly to the south of them Kush. The modern term is Nubia. Ancient Greek texts refer to Kush as Ethiopia, which in Greek means land of burnt faces. The term Ethiopia is not to be confused with the existing country of the name. Ethnically and geographically, this ancient sub-Saharan kingdom of Kush is distinct from the modern-day state of Ethiopia, which lies southeast of it. Egypt's 18th dynasty conquered Kush in the 16th century BC. According to the standard dating that this book will utilize, Kush was a large prize, about as equal in area to Egypt of the pharaohs, to the Egypt of the pharaohs, that is, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt combined, and the so-called two lands. Kush's prime arable land, however, would have been substantially less. The Nile's flooded plains, with its rich black soil, were far narrower in Kush, and its tighter river valley than in the relatively flat expanse of much of Egypt. Kush's population was far smaller, perhaps below a 500,000 people. Estimates of Egyptian population in the late 8th century BC range from 2.5 million to double that. Egypt's domination of these southern highlands were lucrative. Gold was the major resource and may largely explain Egypt's presence in Kush. Numerous gold mines pocketed the arid hills of the northern Kush between the Nile and the Red Sea. The Egyptians also developed a plantation economy in Kush. Farmers worked on large estates owned by the pharaoh, by the local nobility, or by the temples that were established throughout the territory. Egypt often appointed Kushites as high officials to help run the system, and the pharaoh eventually ran Kush not as a foreign colony, but as an appendage of the Egyptian state administrative structure, something that would help explain why in the 8th century BC, the Kushites would see Egypt as a kindred land and not a foreign one. Indeed, as far back as the 14th century, says Stuart Tyson Smith, an archaeologist at the University of California at Los Angeles, the Kushites tended to see Egyptians more as neighbors and collaborators than oppressors or competitors. In addition to gold, the prosperous economy produced abundant cattle, dates, honey, and wine for export. From Kush itself, or from lands to the south, came incense, gum, elephant tusks, leopard skins, exotic animals such as giraffes and elephants, ebony, and other precious woods, not to mention slaves. In the view of today's historians, the Egyptians encountered the spread of their own religious and cultural practices, in effect Egyptianizing And in the view of today's historians, the Egyptians encouraged the spread of their own religious and cultural practices, in effect Egyptianizing much of the population without smothering many of the existing Moors. In time, the Kushites embraced wholeheartedly the variety of worship practice in neighboring Upper Egypt. The most important god was Amun, the center of whose worship was at Thebes, the capital of Upper Egypt. It is unlikely that Egypt imposed willy-nilly the worship of Amun. Rather, that the god may have blended in with an earlier ram-like deity of the Kushites, so that, as one writer speculates, these southerners may have considered him as their own. The Kushites had less interest in the gods of Lower Egypt, such as Ptah, though they did not respect them. Though they still did respect them, as they had proved in resisting earlier Egyptian advances. The Kushites were redoubtable warriors. They adopted the latest developments in military technology and tactics, such as the use of the chariots, and many soldiers into this, and sent many soldiers into the service of Pharaoh. In about this 11th century BC, beset by its own domestic problems, Egypt left Kush. No one knows how, but the now independent Kushites seem to have gathered great political and cultural strength. By the 8th century BC, they had become militarily superior to Egypt. The kingdom's temporal and spiritual capital was Napata, a city just above the Nile's fourth cataract. Napata's most unusual natural feature was a mesa rising 300 feet from the plain, almost like a giant altar. The dramatic landmark called the Pure Mountain, or today Gebel Barkal, was seen as Amon's dwelling place, even after Kush eventually gained its independence. This state cult of Amun would have continued as the kingdom's ideological foundation. The political structure built upon it would show remarkable longevity. The Kushite kingdom, which was known in its latter phase by the name of Meroe, existed at least 1,100 years. That is longer than the span of such other better-known states as ancient Assyria, Israel, Greece, Rome, or the Hittite Empire. Even more astonishing is Kush's political and social stability during these centuries. While scholars do not know whether there was a turnover of dynasties, William Adams observes that the unbroken continuity of the monarchy seems beyond dispute. True, the Egypt of the pharaohs enjoyed a much longer reign, about 3,000 years, than Kush. But bear in mind that during the time, Egypt frequently fell into political disunity, splitting into two or more states and sometimes being taken over and ruled for a century or more by groups from outside the Nile Valley, such as the Hyksos, the Libyans. Indeed, in Egypt of the late 8th century BC, no fewer than 3 different pharaonic dynasties were coexisting uneasily. For the kingdom of Kush, no evidence exists of similar rupture or discontinuity. When in the 4th century AD the kingdom finally did wither, this may have been due less to internal problems than to disruptions originating from the outside world. Bruce Trigger, a noted McGill University anthropologist who has excavated in the Sudan and Egypt and written extensively on ancient societies on several continents, departs from his normal low-key matter-of-fact tone when discussing Kush's long life. He calls the kingdom a spectacular success, expressing puzzlement as to how Kush could have thrived for more than a millennium. Trigger suggests that this may reflect the knowledge of statescraft derived from Nubian prototypes, of which nothing is known. Trigger speculates that homegrown influences in forming these political skills may have been greater than influences of centuries of exposure to the values of Egyptian occupiers. This is one sign of a value system built around the concept of harmony that will help us later to grasp the unusual reason for Kush's decision to confront Assyria. It will also help explain its particular strategy in doing so. In 759 BC, under King Kashta, Kush intervened in some unknown matter in Upper Egypt and exercised leverage, if not sovereignty, over the affair of Thebes, the capital, and Upper Egypt generally. While the nature of this influence is uncertain, there is no sign that Upper Egypt saw Kush as a hostile occupying force or even as an unwelcome intruder. Indeed, motivated by self-protection, traditional Theban circles may have even sought the intervention of Kush as a means of stabilizing Egypt's fractious political landscape. At the site of the great temple of Amun, Thebes was far more than a spiritual center. The best picture we have of its material role in Upper Egypt dates from the time of Ramses III in the 12th century BC. Donald Redford's description evokes awe. The extent and wealth of the Temple of Amun in the twilight of the New Kingdom is staggering. On the death of Ramses III, it owned 600,000 acres, more than 930 square miles of land, 362,000 heads of cattle, 433 gardens, 65 towns, 9 in Canaan, 46 carpenters' shops, and a fleet of 83 cargo boats, over 85,000 cattle, and farmers labored on the god's estate, exclusive of the priests. The bequest of a single pharaoh, Ramses III, to Amun included nearly 1.5 tons of gold and silver, 2.5 tons of copper, and over 1,000 jars of incense, over 25,000 jars of wine, 310,000 measures of grain, besides substantial amounts of flax, vegetables, and fowl. In the 20th dynasty, Amun's estate is coexistent with Upper Egypt. Is coextensive with Upper Egypt. After that time, the status of Thebes deteriorated substantially. It lost much of its population, wealth, and political power. That is, the context of the Kushite entry into the region. It is under Kashta's son and successor Piye that a clearer picture of the new Kush emerges. In the last third of the 8th century BC, its army strode out of the African interior into the Mediterranean world. It was a time in which all of Egypt, not just Thebes, was in cultural and political decline. This unity was acute, fragmenting the part of Egypt lying north of Theban-controlled territory were 11 separate political units, each claiming independence. Running the hodgepodge was five separate kings, as well as assorted princes and chiefs. The kings included Osorkon IV, I think the fourth, a descendant of the 22nd dynasty, who still used the title of pharaoh, although he was, in Kenneth Kitchen's expression, but a powerless shadow pharaoh. Osorkon's capital was the monument-filled city of Tanis in the eastern delta. The 23rd dynasty also still had a pulse, though barely. Heading it was Euput II, a pharaoh whose authority was confined to the district of Leontopolis in the central delta. It was here in northern Egypt, and particularly the delta, that jockeying for power among rival fiefdoms was most intense. The delta warlords were mostly descended from Berbers who, possibly because the climate changed and famine, had come to Egypt's delta from Libya starting in the 12th century BC. Militarily adept, these Libyans, some blue-eyed and fair-skinned, others more swarthy, their soldiers often wore a long braid dangling from one side of their head, had worked as mercenaries for pharaohs and adopted Egyptian mores. In the 10th century BC, one of their number, the commander of all the armed forces and an in-law of the royal family, eased himself into power as pharaoh. Named Sheshonq, most scholars say he corresponds to an infamous biblical personage, one Shishak. According to the first book of Kings, shortly after Solomon's death, King Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. In addition to Sheshonq's 22nd dynasty, Libyans also composed the 23rd dynasty, which got underway in the 9th century. In the late 8th century BC, the most vigorous of the Libyan descendants, Prince Tefnunc of the western delta city of Sais, he exploited the disarray by forging alliances with several other rulers, including Osorkon IV IV. With these allies, Tefnunc invaded the Nile Valley south of the delta. His goal appears to have been to make himself the effective pharaoh of Lower Egypt. He may have threatened to invade as far south as Thebes itself. Politically, that would have constituted an invasion of the Kushite sphere, although This would have represented a grave setback to the institutionalized worship of Amun. At this point, the Kushites were already exercising substantial control of Upper Egypt, perhaps almost by default. As supporters of Amun, these southerners reinforced the pervasive influence of Amun's Thebes-based priesthood against destabilizing forces in Upper Egypt. Tefnonk advanced beyond Memphis and took control of almost all of Lower Egypt and even the northern portion of Upper Egypt. Theban authorities may have appealed to Napata for help. Leaving his seat of power, Napata, Piye, or Pianki, as he is also known, swept down the Nile to confront him around 728. Piye's own account of it is detailed, exciting, and chivalric narrative that is a little known masterpiece of ancient literature. In a series of encounters that included a naval battle at the Nile and an assault on the cities, climaxing in the capture of Lower Egypt's principal city, Memphis, Piye defeated the rebels and had himself crowned as pharaoh of both Lower and Upper Egypt. Yet Piye did not remain in Egypt or otherwise seek to exercise real power there. And what for us may seem like a perplexing climax to the conflict, Piye pardoned those rebels who expressed contrition and who paid him copious tribute, including Ursulkan and Tefnonk himself. Then, instead of consolidating his position and leaving occupying forces in place to exercise control, the conqueror almost immediately sailed back to Napata, apparently taking with him most of his forces. There he remained, pharaoh of all of Egypt, in name only. His pertinent absence from Lower Egypt left the field open for a comeback of Tefnonk, who set himself up as pharaoh of the new 24th dynasty, and for the continued reign of the 22nd dynasty of Ursulkan IV IV. Meanwhile, the 23rd dynasty was tapering out, its authority limited to the area immediately surrounding the city of Leontopolis in the eastern central delta. That three pharaonic dynasties could coexist in the delta attested to the region's enduring division. Ursulkan and his 23rd dynasty counterpart in Put II were essentially spent forces. In Kitchen's words, local petty chiefs. They were the last of their respective lines and were subordinate to the strong man, Tefnonk. Adams gives a well-balanced summation of Piye's campaign. Although he assumed the titles of pharaoh, Piye was neither a conqueror nor a despot of ordinary sort. His intervention in Egypt was prompted by direct and repeated pleas from the north, and his chief interest from the beginning to the end seems to have been to relieve the threat to Thebes, and thus protect the domain of Amun. The vigorous pursuit of that policy led him to subdue every rival prince in Egypt, but having obtained their nominal submission, he was content to return homeward and leave Egypt to its own devices. Not surprisingly, his enemies rewarded his humane and lenient treatment by repudiating their oaths and resuming their dynastic ambitions the moment his back was turned. Some historians have expressed puzzlement over Piye's decision to disengage from the politics of Lower Egypt, others scorn. Yet the policy proved to be far from disastrous. In making his comeback, Tefnonk kept to the north, never seeking to extend his authority south of Memphis, or otherwise acting to provoke Piye. Indeed, one can ask if imposing themselves on the north was really an option for the Kushites. Controlling Lower Egypt, and in particular the Delta, whose swamplands was a paradise for fugitives and rebels, would have been beyond the resources of Kush, those whose population was far smaller than that of Lower Egypt. Rather than subjugate and exploit Egypt, Piye gave it an unusually long leash. I.E.S. Edwards of the British Museum reaches the reasonable conclusion that Piye was content to establish a protectorate over the country while leaving its administration largely in the hands of those who were already in authority. From their actions, it is clear that the Kushites' aim was not to dominate, but rather to restore order to the land that they held in esteem, in which they shared a common heritage, particularly a religious one, a land with which, for centuries, they had enjoyed a close, non-adversarial relationship. The Kushite withdrawal. The Kushite withdrawal from Lower Egypt would have taken place about a year after their arrival. The Napatans' absence would continue until about 712, several years after Pa's death. This is the most likely date of the second conquest of Egypt, which would have been carried out by Pa's brother and successor, Shebako. Historians usually date the start of the 25th dynasty to Shebako's conquest rather than that of Pa, since Pa did not establish continuous rule in Egypt. The 16 years or so between the two conquests represents an unsettled interlude in the affairs of Lower Egypt. It appears to be this tumultuous period that Isaiah is describing when speaking of Yahweh. He declares, "I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight one against the other, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom." In this period between Pa's conquest of Lower Egypt in 728 and Shebako's reconquest in 712, Hebrews, Assyrians, Egyptians, and Kushites interacted significantly. Around 726 to 725, King Hosea of Israel stopped paying tribute to Assyria and appealed to Egypt for help against Assyrian reprisals. In trying to grasp Judeo-Egyptian relations in this period, it is important to know to whom Egypt's many rulers, real and nominal, Hosea appealed. 2 Kings says only that Hosea sent his envoys to one, So, king of Egypt. Among the swarms of kings, princes, and chiefs in Egypt, none had a name resembling that. A lively debate therefore exists among scholars over precisely which potential ally the biblical writer may have had in mind. Scholars propose that three separate candidates for Osorkon IV, Tefnank, or Pa. Each theory contains at least one fatal flaw. Osorkon was too weak to offer help. Tefnank had more sympathy for Assyria than Israel, and Pa was too remote geographically. A combination of two of these, however, would make most sense. King So would have been Osorkon, but only in the deltas, only in that delta king's capacity as a middleman to Pa. The Kushite king was in Napata, hard to reach for Sumerian messengers unfamiliar with the long, difficult route. Osorkon, on the other hand, ruled over Tanis in the northeastern delta, the first kingdom the messengers would have come to as they entered Egypt. The former ally of Tefnank now recognized Pa as his overlord, and his family and that of Pa had a close, almost in-law relationship. Indeed, Pa would have probably have been ambassador at Osorkon's court. Pa would have probably had ambassadors at Osorkon's court. In any event, Osorkon's couriers could have swiftly relayed all communications to Napata. For this reason, the Delta King would have been the appropriate conduit through which to appeal to Pa. However, the real addressee Hosea was unable to obtain help from him. Whoever the real addressee was, Hosea was unable to obtain help from him. Because the Israelite king had withheld tribute, Assyria's king Shalmaneser had Hosea thrown into prison. Hosea's rebellious stance must have received broad public support because Shalmaneser had invaded Israel and besieged the capital, Samaria. In 720, on the same foray into Kor in which they stepped up their deportation of the soon-to-be 10 lost tribes of Israel, the Assyrians under Sargon conquered Gaza, and then about a day's march southwest of the city sieged Raphia on the doorstep of Egypt in the eastern Sinai. An Egyptian leader, who may have been Sargon IV, dispatched an army commander to join forces with the disenfranchised king of Gaza, Hanno, to turn back the Assyrians at Raphi. Our only source is Sargon. He dismissively writes that this commander became frightened of the clangor of many weapons and fled, to be seen no more. In another of his writings, Sargon expresses even more contempt for the Egyptian commander, saying he ran off like a shepherd whose sheep had been carried off. Whether the Egyptian defense performed so lamentably is open to question. Assyrian royal text served as propaganda for home consumption. In his description of this clash, Sargon says that only Hanno was captured. He does not mention taking any Egyptian prisoners. Often, Assyrian kings also allude to their records to captures they may have made. Often, Assyrian kings do allude to their records to captures they may have made. So the omission here could have significance. Two things, however, are incontestable. Sargon did create, by his own account, havoc just inside Egypt's territory, and he did not advance farther. Around 716, Sargon again invaded Philistia. He had advanced beyond Raphia, probably to at least as far as the Brook of Egypt, or Wadi el-Arish, the traditional Egyptian border in the eastern Sinai. The modest stream ran into the Mediterranean, perhaps 50 miles southwest of Gaza. The change in topography made it a natural location for a frontier. East of the Brook of Egypt lay cultivated fields and pastures, but west of it there was only scrub and desert wastes. This time, rather than fight, an Egyptian leader, whom most scholars identify as Sargon, sent tribute to Sargon. The terror-inspiring glamour of Ashur, my lord, overwhelmed him, writes Sargon, using one of his favorite expressions. And he brought a present, 12 big horses from Egypt, which have not their equal in this country, Assyria. Intended for breeding purposes, his gift was a handsome one. The tribute would have likely have had military value, since the bloodline lent itself to war horses. This present, therefore, would have conveyed a greater sense of appeasement than chests of jewels or some other conventional tribute that Sargon had probably already bestowed upon him. The point here is that anyone concerned about Assyria's design would not have been reassured by the fact that Sargon had halted at the border. Assyria had demonstrated its capability of invading Egypt. This campaign must have alarmed both Egypt and vigilant Kush for a second reason. Sargon established a military garrison at the border. This must have represented a constant reminder of Assyria's military threat. What's more, it could have served as a vexing filter for Egypt's overland trade with Kor. The garrison may have functioned as a toll gate or as a point for transferring shipments from Egypt's caravans to Assyrian-controlled ones. In 712, Sargon sent a force to put down Ashdod's rebellion, which had started the year before. In a vain attempt to summon military help, the Philistine rebels sent what Sargon describes as bribes to an unnamed Egyptian king, presumably one of the Delta monarchs, perhaps Sargon. Sargon writes that the leader of that rebellion, Imani, fled deep into Egypt, apparently to an area under Kushite control. It is significant that even at this time, more than a decade before 701, a second anti-Assyrian rebellion in Kor Israel's Hosea, having been the first, should have seen the Kushite as a potential recourse against the empire. It is shortly after this, perhaps, that in the same year, that Shabako followed Pia's example and invaded Lower Egypt. He conquered the entire territory, overcoming the army of Bakenranef of Sais, who was Tefnunk's son and his successor as the pharaoh of the 24th dynasty. Why did Pia's brother take over Egypt? The aggression has puzzled some historians and prompted others to make trivializing hypotheses. T.G.H. James, for example, speculates that what inspired Shabako was crass power politics or petty sibling competition, an attempt to equal Pia's achievement. But this ignores the Assyrian dimension. Shabako's likely motive was to unify Egypt and strengthen it so as to better defend against invasion. 3 times in the previous 8 years, Assyrians had advanced to the gates of Egypt. Just why they had not invaded the Nile Valley is unclear. Perhaps it was that the armies had suffered so many casualties in earlier combat in Kor. Perhaps they lacked supplies for a large army's arduous trek across the Sinai Desert. Perhaps the tribute from the frightened rulers of northern Egypt made it easier to turn back. Or maybe an intriguing possibility, the Assyrians had not halted at Egypt's traditional border in the eastern Sinai in 716, but had actually entered Egypt proper. Haim Tadmor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem cites a text by Sargon on that campaign that includes these 2 sentences: I opened and sealed harbor of Egypt. I opened the sealed harbor of Egypt. I opened the sealed harbor of Egypt. The Syrians and the Egyptians I mingled together, and I made them trade with each other. Sargon does not identify this sealed harbor, but Tadmor speculates that he may be referring to Pelusium or Sile, the eastmost ancient Egyptian ports. These 2 cities are near where the Suez Canal now pierces the isthmus, roughly 130 miles west of Lower Egypt's customary border at the Brook of Egypt. If Tadmor's suggestion is correct, it seems that the Assyrians had not simply knocked at Egypt's door, but had penetrated well beyond it. From Shabako's point of view, Assyria would have been in an excellent position to summon a large army to this city and to use it as a staging area for a full-scale invasion of the Nile Valley. Quite aside from the hard-to-resolve question of which side of the border the sealed harbor was on, we should not overlook something else in Sargon's statement. I made Assyrian and Egyptians trade with each other. Tadmor's assessment of the Assyrian king's rationale seems valid. This passage of great importance elucidates the economic motives behind the military campaigns on Egypt's border. Sargon plainly succeeded in imposing on Egypt a trade arrangement congenial to Assyria, regardless whether the Assyrians had advanced to Pelusium/Sile, or simply the eastern Sinai. Egypt would have seen their presence as a grave threat to its national interests in terms of both defense and international commerce. The Kushites would not have wanted simply to view this passively from afar. Unlike Pia's conquest of 16 years before, no stela had been found that would indicate just how Shabako's campaign fared or what resistance it encountered. What is clear, however, is that the new pharaoh, unlike his late older brother, became, loosely speaking, overlord of the entire country. He even moved to establish some degree of authority in Sais, the stronghold of Tefnunk and Bakenranef. He appointed as Sais' governor a man called Ameris, perhaps a Kushite. This is not to say that all Egypt was docile under Kushite rule, but it is to say that Shabako and his 2 successors of the 25th dynasty, Shibitku and Taharka, restored a degree of unity in Egypt that it had not seen in 300 years. In summing up pharaonic Egypt's 3,000 years, James makes this acute observation. Perhaps the first and most important equality that typified this civilization was continuity. In every aspect of Egyptian life, in every manifestation of its culture, a deep conservatism can be observed. This was particularly true under the 25th dynasty in revivifying an Egypt that was ununified and strong. In revivifying an Egypt that was unified and strong, the Kushite pharaoh looked back to shining periods of centralized rule, to the New Kingdom, 16th to 13th century BC, and even the Old Kingdom, 27th to 22nd centuries BC. As Adam notes, their aims were nothing less than restoration of Egyptian culture and religion to their original purity. The 25th dynasty conservatism manifests itself in the way Pa and other pharaohs had themselves buried in Kush inside pyramids, a pharaonic tradition that had lapsed many centuries before. Just as the Kushite pharaohs' religious rites returned to ancient forms, so did their art spectacularly. With its ambitious renovations of great monuments and constructions of new ones, the dynasty may have done more to enhance the glory of Thebes than any Egyptian ruler since Ramses IV, some 400 years before. One scholar, Karl Heinz Praise, suggests that political considerations may have played a role in hearkening back to the ancient monarchs' ways. He says that as a result of the Kushite sovereign need to appear as a genuine pharaoh, the Kushite sovereign's need to appear as a genuine pharaoh, an exaggerated form of orthodoxy was flaunted. Historian Stefan Wenig, an expert on Kushite art, agrees, saying that Nepatan pharaohs sought to help legitimize their rule through use of titles, crowns, and jewelry that resembled those of Egyptian monarchs. Yet Wenig also notes that they played up their distinctive origins. Wall paintings at a temple built by Taharqa at Qasr Ibrahim also, for example, depict this pharaoh not with a red-brown skin as customary in Egypt, but a dark brown flesh tone characteristic of Kushites. This suggests the Kushite ruler was proud of his southern origin, and however Egyptianized they became, they remained so throughout their history. What about the quality of the art, including the architecture under the 25th dynasty? Although modern scholarship tends to be dismissive of the dynasty's political and foreign policy aspects, art experts, as a rule, are generous. John H. Taylor, a curator in the British Museum's Department of Egyptian Antiquities, notes that while the Kushites borrowed from archaic Egyptian models, they brought to sculpture and relief a southern element all their own, which shows in the vigor and unprecedented realism of their works, together with the emphasis of the ethnic features of Nubians. Indeed, says German scholar Dietrich Wildung, the Kushites had extraordinary artistic impact in their injection of vigorous new originality into Egyptian traditional forms of architecture and sculpture. W. Stevenson Smith, curator of Egyptian art at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, further observes that the revival of Egyptian art, which began in Dynasty XXV, 25, was part of a resurgence of Egyptian spirit, which, without any real modification from abroad, was stimulated by vigorous Kushite rulers who had close religious ties with Thebes and a long tradition of Egyptian civilization. Three art experts, three users of the word vigor. One understands why Jean Leclant, an eminent authority on Kushite art and a professor at the Institut de France, sums up the 25th dynasty's impact on Egypt's art in this lauding manner. Under Shabako, Sibitku, and Taharqa, Egypt underwent a veritable renaissance. Regarding the first Kushite conquest of Lower Egypt, it is curious that historians have made no serious attempt to explain why people from Africa's interior embarked on an extraordinary campaign, 728 728, that reached the shores of the Mediterranean, the first initiative of this kind in recorded history. Just as Assyria's menacing shadow affected Shabako's reign, so that Mesopotamian power might well have helped impel his predecessor PA's military campaign. I believe PA's sweep into Lower Egypt was motivated to a significant extent by a desire to demonstrate to Assyria that an invasion of the country would be met with force. Assyria had been on Egypt's doorstep before. In 734 BC, during his invasion of Kor, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser had sacked Gaza and gone as far as the Egyptian border. There, he erected a statue of himself, an unmistakable way of marking his territory. 2 years later, after putting down a rebellion somewhere in Kor, Tiglath-Pileser had returned to Egypt's border in order to exercise control over the main trade route through the Sinai to the Nile Valley. He named an Arab sheikh to a new position as an overseer of the Egyptian frontier, and there erected another statue of my royal self, as a token, he said, of the power and the might which I establish over the lands. These actions demonstrate a serious intent to wield some degree of control over Egypt's commerce in Kor. In conquering Egypt, therefore, PA would have prevented Tefnunk's expansion into central Egypt and perhaps even to Thebes, while cooling the turmoil in Lower Egypt. Second, he would have signaled to Assyria the Kushite military ability to defend the territorial and commercial interests of both Egypt and Kush. Therefore, it would have been in PA's interest for Tefnunk and Absorkon to command substantial forces, so long as these were not used to expand again into Egypt's heartland. Without this military presence, Assyria might easily invaded. This second rationale, sending a message to Assyria, was probably the clinging reason for PA's invasion. Otherwise, he could have simply made a defensive stand somewhere north of Thebes, preventing further territorial gains by Tefnunk and letting Lower Egypt go in its own way. By advancing to the delta, PA demonstrates to Assyria that Kush had the will and ability to defend all of Egypt. Better for the Kushites to face a tired and strained invader near the Sinai than to confront the same army in Middle Egypt after that army had rested well and reinvigorated itself with the abundant provisions of the at hand. By reducing, though not ending, Lower Egypt's internal divisions and turmoil, PA also strengthened Egypt for a possible showdown with Assyria. We may surmise that along the 11 separate political entities in Egypt at the time, at least several may have been in friendly contact with Assyria in the expectation that they could benefit from an Assyrian invasion into Egypt. Seen in this light, PA's granting of pardon to Tefnunk and Absorkon and his tolerance of their return to power once they had pledged loyalty to him seems less like an altruistic naivete than a recognition that their continued presence without unbridled expansionism could prevent the sort of power vacuum that might lead to more internal disorder. These former rebels presented the first ingenious line of defense against invaders from Assyria. PA saw himself as a guardian of Egypt's interests. The last thing he wanted was for Egypt to become easier prey for Assyria. Indeed, his stele contains a line that suggests that he was sending a message beyond Kush in Egypt, as the stele describes PA's sailing northward by the Nile to engage the enemy along the way, worshipping at Thebes to seek strength from Amun. It states, "The grandeur of His Majesty attained the Asiatics, and every heart trembled before him." For Asiatics, read all people of East Sinai. It is hard to think of why PA would be proud of impressing foreigners unless it was to deter their aggression. Tiglath-Pileser died in 727, removing some of the immediate Assyrian threat and permitting Pa to return to Napata, probably that same year. He could do so because he made his point. This could explain why Sargon did not penetrate Lower Egypt's threshold in 720. Egypt's defenders, who might have included Osorkon, appear to have been successful since Sargon did not enter. It would be logical that, as a part of a peace accord after his conquest, Pa had insisted that in the event of future Assyrian threat, Lower Egyptian statelets such as Osorkon's Tanis help defend the Sinai, instead of accommodating themselves to Assyrian invaders and serving as their appointed stand-ins at Sais was to do several generations later. Pa would have been sure to leave some of his own forces behind in the north to stabilize the uneasy coalition. Fortifying this hypothesis, the Napatan king adopted a strategy of defending Egypt are two separate collections of reliefs from Sargon's palace in Assyria and the temple of Amun at Napata. Adorning the palace of Dur Sharukin is a wall relief depicting a battle in which Assyrian horsemen confronted infantrymen, the facial features of the latter allowing their identification as Kushites, says one scholar, who deduces that the conflict would had to be against Sargon in his Sinai/Gaza campaign of 720. Another relief shows soldiers with similar features serving as defenders in an unidentified siege. This too has also been given a date of 720. Both sculptures then appear to give Kushite soldiers a leading role in the defense against the Assyrian campaign. At Napata, a military scene carved into the wall has faintly survived. Anthony Spallinger of New Zealand's University of Auckland dates it to PA's reign. The scene shows 4 Kushite soldiers on foot and 1 on horseback defeating enemy troops. From their helmets, Spallinger concludes the foe must have been Assyrian. The precise style of helmet, which resembles an inverted funnel with a knob on the top, was in use during the rule of Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon, but not during Sennacherib's reign. Spallinger does not attempt to give a date or location for the battle, but 720 in the Sinai would seem a logical context. Both the Assyrian and the Kushite artists portray their own sides as having the upper hand, although no historian have attempted to put these scenes into adequate political context. These sculptures are important as they attest to a Kushite effort to defend Egypt from Assyria as early as PA's time. The coherent rationale of Cush's double conquest of Egypt in 728 and 712 provides a logic for the sudden emergence of this North Central African kingdom as a guiding force in Egypt in the last third of the 8th century BC. In the absence of such a rationale, one might have to assume that it was sheer luck that the dynasty that was in power in 701 just happened to possess one of the strongest, probably the strongest army in Egypt's many centuries. That the Kushites were in the right place at the right time in 701 was no accident of history, and that they responded positively to Hezekiah's appeal for military help was also no fluke. At times of serious crisis in earlier centuries, engaging pharaohs had occasionally elevated younger kinsmen to share the throne with them. Aging pharaohs had occasionally invited younger kinsmen to share the throne with them. The 2 pharaohs would be equal in theory, both holding the same divine status, though each would have his own area of specialization. While the younger monarch would generally be responsible for military affairs, the senior would continue to deal with the other nation's leaders. Around 706, Shabako appears to have created such a co-regency, elevating his son, Shibitku, to share power with him. Establishing this co-regency would have made good sense because of the huge amount of territory involved and the need for rapid decisions during the crisis years. One pharaoh may have been primarily responsible for Lower Egypt, scenes of most of the military buildup, and the other for the rest of Egypt and Kush. Chpt would probably have been in charge of defending the frontier, while his father would have overseen the south, retaining ultimate authority over foreign policy and diplomacy. Because few contemporary writings that deal with Chpt have survived, we know even less about him through Shabako. One of the few things that is certain is that he extradited Imani, the refugee rebel, to Assyria around 705. Sargon ascribes this to his own presence on Chpt. The terrifying splendor of my royalty overpowered him, and fright overcame him. The Kushites, he says, placed Imani in fetters, shackles, and bonds of iron, and they brought him before me in Assyria after a difficult journey. Some historians see this Kushite response as spineless. John Bright goes as far as to call it craven. Yet appeasement may well have been Egypt and Kush's only sensible option. Sargon appears to imply that he had threatened Chpt with invasion, and the last thing the pharaoh needed was to bring down the fury of Assyria on Egypt before he was ready to make his own bold move. Allowing events to speak for themselves, we can see that the reason behind the 25th dynasty incursion into Kor, the first, of course, is self-defense. Assyria had cut a destructive swath through Kor and then advanced to the threshold of Egypt. Treasure house of the ancient world, in an increasingly menacing manner, a total of 5 times in the previous 33 years, in 734, 734, 733, 732, 720, 716, and 712. On one of those occasions, 716, it had perhaps barged through the door. Assyria eventually did invade Egypt unsuccessfully in 674 and victoriously in 671. The empire represented a mortal threat to it. Did Egypt have intelligence that Sennacherib planned to invade Egypt in 701 after bringing Kor to heel, or that he planned to do so in the next years after consolidating his control of the region? We do not know, but the 25th dynasty would have deemed it madness to sit back and wait. The new Assyrian king's appetite for war, as displayed in his swift response to the rebellion in Kor and in the conquest he had already undertaken east of Nineveh during the first 3 years of his reign, showed him to be ruthlessly ambitious. For Egypt, northern Philistia and the Phoenician cities of Sidon and Tyre were of little defensive significance, though very important for trade. But southern Philistia, including Ekron, Ashkelon, and Gaza, were crucial. Southernmost Kor represented a land bridge between the Assyrian Empire and Egypt. Assyria, which had no navy, needed an advanced position to serve as a logistical base for an invasion across the Sinai into Africa. The 25th dynasty, in short, felt it needed to preserve southern Kor as a relatively neutral zone or buffer in order to protect the Nile Valley, including not only Lower and Upper Egypt, but Kush as well. Despite its remoteness, Kush was not invulnerable to attack. Far from it. In 591 BC, under Psamtik II of the 26th dynasty, an Egyptian army employed Ionian, Carian, and Rhodian mercenaries would sack the Nile city of Napata. Employing Ionian, Carian, and Rhodian mercenaries would sack the city of Napata. Later that same century, Persian king Cambyses would also try to conquer Kush, apparently turning back when he ran out of supplies, and in the 1st century BC, the Romans succeeded in reaching Napata and plundering it. The dynasty's second reason was trade. Kush and Egypt had important commercial ties to maintain with the region. Egypt's major overland trade road, the Way of the Sea, traversed the Sinai and continued along the coast of Philistia until Phoenicia, the trading center of the Mediterranean, the Near and Middle East. Sea trade was extensive as well. Byblos, located in the present-day Lebanon, traditionally ranked as Egypt's favorite port in core. By sea came timber, particularly cedar, from Phoenicia's coniferous forests. Egypt, with little wood of its own, needed the timber for shipbuilding and construction of buildings. Other products from Kor that found markets in Egypt included olive oil, wine, and spices, as well as salves and alum, both used in medicine, and resin, a timber byproduct used in mummification. Keeping these land and sea routes open and free of hostile interference would have been a central economic concern for Egypt and Kush alike. It is unclear to what extent, if any, the Assyrian Empire was hindering trade at this time. The pharaoh might have feared, however, that if Sennacherib were to succeed in consolidating his hold on the region, Egypt and Kushite commercial interests could only suffer, just as rolling back the Assyrian presence could only help. Trade, then, may have not been a primary reason for the Kushite dynasty's intervention, but it would have represented a handsome fringe benefit. It was in Kushite Egypt's compelling self-interest, then, to commit itself totally to the task of keeping southern Kor out of Assyrian hands. After sending an initial army composed of the forces that were already in northern Egypt to confront the Assyrian army, the government would have felt the stakes sufficiently high to mobilize and dispatch additional troops from somewhere in Egypt or Kush. From elsewhere in Egypt or Kush. When deciding to launch themselves militarily to the Middle East, would the Kushite planners have felt out of their element there or on unfamiliar ground? Contrary to the popular understanding, sub-Saharan soldiers were no strangers to that part of the world. Records indicate that their involvement in Kor for at least 1,500 years prior to Sennacherib's invasion. Indeed, some 6 centuries before the conflict, Kushite soldiers served under the ultimate authority of Egypt, were actually posted in Jerusalem as defenders of that town. Prior to 701, the most recent involvement of black Africans in Kor would have probably been 712, when some served as mercenaries to the Ashtorite rebellion against Assyria. For Kushite strategists in 701, an expedition across the Sinai into the coastal plain and hills of Kor would not have been so necessarily as geographically exotic an adventure. It would have been within the Kushite military traditional area of deployment. Yet military activity was not the only means by which Kushites had become familiar with Kor and even regions beyond. Commerce was another. Kushite trade missions would have journeyed as far as Assyria. The Kushites bred an unusually large horse in the dry highlands in the Dongala Reach on the west bank of the Nile, just beyond Kawa, downstream of Napata. In an article on Assyrian forces, Stephanie Daly describes a document from 732 BC that has found at Nimrud, that has been found at Nimrud, Assyria's capital at the time. The document mentions Kushites in a manner as to suggest the Kushite horse experts were at the court of Tiglath-Pileser, and that the building of important Nubian horses, and that the business of importing Nubian horses into Assyria began in earnest during his reign. The Assyrians deemed the large Kush horse to be the most desirable of all breeds for the charioteers, as distinct from the cavalry. So coveted was it as a battle horse that Daly speculates the unstated main objective of both Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon is in establishing trade posts or at or inside the Egyptian border was to improve their pipeline to the horses. Various states and corps also appear to have prized a matchless chariot puller. These various states and corps also seem to have prized these matchless chariot pullers. The point is that prior to its ascendancy in Egypt, Cush was not so isolated from markets and core in Mesopotamia as one might imagine. Indeed, it is reasonable to ask whether a mission to Assyria's capital by Cushite horse expert did not also serve as an opportunity for intelligence gathering. Much of an underdog would Kushite-Egypt have been? How much of an underdog would Kushite-Egypt have been in a matchup between its total forces and Assyria's total forces? Spallinger's even-handed study of the available evidence of Kushite field tactics, weaponry, and protective gear in PA's reign concludes that these were backward compared with Assyria's. Still, Cush would have taken pains over the next generation to narrow the military gap between itself and Assyria. An allusion by Isaiah to Kushite Egypt testifies to the impressiveness of its forces just prior to the showdown of 701. The prophet says Jerusalem seeks help from the 25th dynasty forces because of its trust in the multitude of their chariots and in the great strength of their horsemen. Kushite Egypt probably also had the element of surprise in its favor. After all, no pharaoh since the marauding Shishak 200 years before had sent an army to Kor, and that had been in an offensive, not a defensive capacity. Sennacherib may have anticipated the 25th dynasty would also follow the familiar pattern of waiting for the Assyrian army to reach the Sinai before trying to block it. Finally, we do not know the portion of Assyria's total armed forces. We do not know what portion of Assyria's total armed forces was on that campaign in Kor. Anticipating an easy sweep, Sennacherib may not have campaigned at maximum strength. We can confidently assume, however, that the 25th dynasty was ready to throw everything it had at Sennacherib. For Sibitku, sending his troops into Kor would have been the penultimate gamble. If having drained Egypt and Cush of all available manpower for his desperate attempt to head the enemy off, the 25th dynasty would lose in Kor. The Nile Valley would be virtually defenseless. If the late summer of 701 BC, Judah's survival was hanging in the balance, so too was the security of Egypt and ultimately of Cush.